Hello students and welcome to this episode on the history of cinema. In the earlier episodes, you have learned about how cinema came about in the fag end of the 19th century and slowly gained maturity as a medium of expression. In this particular episode, we are going to discuss primarily the crossover era when cinema crossed over from being silent to being talkies. Now, in the first 3 decades of its existence, cinema has been silent. That means the images were not accompanied with any kind of sound. Okay, and in these 3 decades, cinema gained maturity and it even earned the status of an art form thanks to the first maestros like Méliès and Porter, who discovered the potential of cinema as an excellent storytelling medium. And then maestros like Griffith, Fritz Lang and Eisenstein, who gave wings to the cinematic expression. And it is in their hands that cinema earned the respect of an art form. However, towards the end of the second decade of the 20th century, that is in the late 1920s, things began to change. Okay? And the thrust came from 2 directions. First was the technological development of recording sound along with the images. That was the first technological thrust that came, and the second was the urge for survival. So, in this episode we shall see how this crossover happened, and it's actually a fascinating story. Now, one must remember that even when one watched silent films, the experience of viewing films had never been silent, because there was always live musical accompaniment. In the movie hall, there used to be an orchestra pit. The musicians sat in the orchestra pit and they played live to the accompaniment of the visuals. So, they had seen the film earlier, they composed the music accordingly and they gave a live performance in sync with the rhythm of the film. So, this live musical accompaniment was always there. Also, when cinema was shown in the fairgrounds, etc., people used to stand behind the screen and give live sound effects like gunshots or even horses' hooves, riding horses and things like that. They used to give live sound effects also. So, therefore, there was always a live sound accompaniment with the films, and for the audience watching the film in complete silence was not really an experience even in the early years of cinema's existence. Now, one of the earliest experiments of recording sound with visuals in sync happened in Edison's studio in America, that is in New York, in the year 1889. And the experiment was done by one of his chief technicians, W.K.L. Dixon. Now, he gave a violin performance standing in front of that horn of the sound recorder. He gave a violin performance and 2 of his collaborators, they waltzed to the accompaniment of the music. And this visual was recorded, and along with the visual, the sound of the violin was also recorded. So, many years later, when film historians were doing research on early cinema, they chanced upon this footage, and when they played this footage, to their astonishment, it was not a silent footage at all, but there was sound emanating from the reels. That means the sound was recorded. In those years, in the 19th century, late 19th century, the medium on which sound was recorded was either a wax cylinder like this, or a little later in the early 20th century, it was a disc. Okay. So, both for the wax cylinder as well as the disc, the time duration of the music or any kind of sound recording was maximum 3 minutes. On the other hand, the duration of the films by then had, cinema had matured, and the duration of the films at one reel was about 10 minutes. Alright. So, therefore, the problem that these sound people faced is that duration of the sound, it always fell short of the duration of the film, okay, and therefore either more than one disc or more than one cylinder has to be used even for a short one reeler film. So, that was a cumbersome problem. Second problem was that amplifying the sound for the presentation of a large audience, because by then the cinema halls were growing bigger, and even if one consider this nickel audience, which were about 100 seaters or so, you know, the sound to be loud enough for everybody in the nickel audience to hear it, it had to have a certain level of loudness. Okay, so that could not be achieved in these early years of sound audio experimentation. Also, synchronizing the sound to the filmed event also became a problem, particularly when the discs or the cylinders had to be changed. So, every time it had to be changed, the synchronicity, there was a chance of the synchronicity of image and audio being broken. So, the technicians were trying to grapple with these problems, but cinema, on the other hand, was the expression of silent cinema was maturing. Cinema was becoming more and more mature. The film durations were becoming longer and longer. And in fact, film historians say that silent films attained a level of self-contained perfection. These films did not look incomplete without synchronized sound. So, silent films were doing very well, they were being received very well by an audience, and they didn't feel the urge to transform into talkies or to cross over into the world of audio, apart from this live sound accompaniment. Alright, so that was the scenario in the 1920s, and oblivious of these developments in the world of cinema, the sound engineers, particularly those who are working in Western Electric and Bell Telephone Laboratories, they were working away to solve the problems of synchronous sound recording and the sound recording being long enough to last at least one reel, you know, all these practical problems that the sound designers had faced. So, they were trying their best to grapple with these problems and solve these problems, and they came up with a gadget called the Vitaphone. And they patented the Vitaphone, and they went to Hollywood to give demonstrations of the Vitaphone. Now, this Vitaphone was a sound in disc system. That means the sound was recorded on 33 RPM records, and for one full length film, several records had to be used. So, there was this automatic changing system, and to make sure that the synchronicity would not be broken, and there was some kind of rudimentary amplification that was also provided using these horns and everything. And so, they went from studio to demonstrate the Vitaphone, and they were politely turned down, because the instrument was too heavy, too expensive and too cumbersome, and the film producers were very happy with what they were doing because they were making good business, and the films were also critically acclaimed, and it was a kind of stable situation. Okay, so the Vitaphone didn't find many takers except the Warner Brothers. When they came to the Warner Brothers studio, the Warner Brothers actually liked the idea. Now, the Warner Brothers studio at that time in the 1920s was not among the big five studios. The big five were MGM, 20th Century Fox, then Columbia, Universal, Paramount. So, these were the big five, and Warner Brothers belonged to the little three. So, they could, in terms of their production values, in terms of their market, they could not compete with the big five, and at that point of time, they were facing a financial crunch. So, what the Warner Brothers bosses said, that since the others had turned down the Vitaphone, they bought the rights of the Vitaphone, okay, the solitary, the exclusive rights of the Vitaphone, and they said that their next film will be a sound film. And that is how they would bring something new into the market, and they would, through that, they would like to capture a greater share of the market, okay. So, therefore, they struck a deal with the Western Electric, and they bought exclusive rights of the Vitaphone, and the film that they started working on was Don Juan. It was a musical extravaganza, high budget film, and they had actually two very clear-cut missions in their mind. Number one, when the films traveled to small towns and villages, you know, live orchestra that could play good quality music was not available everywhere. They were available in the big cities, but not in the small towns and villages. So, they thought if they could record a orchestra played by a very good choir or very good music company, then that could be recorded along with the visuals, along with the images, and that could be played back when the film traveled from place to place. okay, so that even the small town people had the advantage of hearing a good orchestra. So that was one thing, and the second mission was of course to give a tough competition to the big five. So with these two missions in mind, they proceeded and then they started the production of Don Juan, so which was released. It was the first sound film to be released. The music was recorded by New York Philharmonic Orchestra, and it was a big budget film anyway. It was a musical extravaganza, and it was, the total cost of production was over $3 million in those days. Over $3 million is not a small amount. Before the film began, there was a recorded speech of Will Hayes. Will Hayes was the president of MPPDA. MPPDA means Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America. So there was this recorded speech which was before the actual film began, and after that the actual film, which was otherwise a silent film, no dialogue, but the music was recorded, which was done by the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. Now Don Juan ran for 8 weeks in New York alone and grossed $800,000. Okay, in New York alone it earned $800,000, so it was a hit. It was a novelty, naturally it was a novelty, so people flocked to the movie halls to watch the film, and the Warner Brothers were encouraged. Their financial status improved through this experiment or through the plunge that they had taken, and they were encouraged. So their next production in the pipeline was a film called The Jazz Singer. So it was about a musician who was also a part of a religious group, and he was a Jewish musician. So his career, it was about that person's music career, and the main lead role was played by a black actor called Al Jolson.
Mammy, the sun shines east, the sun shines west, but I know where the sun shines best. Mammy, Mammy, my heartstrings are tangled around Alabama.
The film was conceived as a silent film with intertitles and everything, and it was thought that only the music part would be recorded and the orchestral sound would play along with the film. Otherwise, the design of the film was exactly like a silent film. Okay, no dialogues etc. had been written. But while the shooting was going on, Al Jolson, he ad-libbed, he improvised some dialogues, and he said this, wait a minute, you ain't heard anything yet, which got recorded because the sound equipment was there, it got recorded. And the film producers, they just in a very tongue-in-cheek manner, they kept that recording. They didn't delete it, they just kept that recording, and it was in sync with the lip movement. So when the film was released in the year 1927, and when they heard Al Jolson kneeling down and saying, wait a minute, you ain't heard anything yet, there was standing ovation in the hall. Because this was totally unexpected, they had not heard anything like this before. There was standing ovation, and The Jazz Singer was a runaway hit. It was a big success. Now, does that mean that this Vitaphone and the experiment of the Warner Brothers was just a passing phase? Well, the Warner Brothers had invested too much into this entire project to make it a passing phase. On the other hand, the other studios really wished that this sound experiment would be a passing phase, and then they would come back to the stability of the silent films. But that was not to be, because the audience had already got a taste of synchronized sound or synchronized dialogue, and they wanted more and more of it. Okay? So therefore, sound or talkies came to stay, and the other studios were forced to cross over to the talkies. They faced a big problem, and the problem being that the exclusive rights of the Vitaphone were with Warner Brothers. So that means the other studios could not use the Vitaphone for their sound films. So they had to do fresh research to come up with an alternative. And in fact, they came up with better alternatives. So two of these alternatives are like this. Lee De Forest, he was an electronics engineer, and he is more famous for his invention of the amplifier and the oscillator circuits, the triode valves rather. So he developed a sound on film system where the sound would not be recorded on a disc like a Vitaphone, but it would get recorded on the film strip itself by the principle of photoelectricity. Okay, so it was a sound on film system. So that was Lee De Forest's invention, and Fox, 20th Century Fox, they did their own research and they came up with their own system which they called the Fox Movietone, which was also a sound in film system. Now what 20th Century Fox did, they sent out their cameramen with this Fox Movietone out into the frontier or into wherever things were happening to capture news, live news, okay. And with the news there would be interviews and people talking, what today we say vox pop, that also would get recorded. And these small news capsules were played in the movie halls and people liked them. Okay. So these were the Movietone recordings of news which were regularly played in the movie halls before the real movie began. Alright. So that helped in popularizing this sound on film system, because this was definitely more handy, more user friendly than the Vitaphone sound on disc system. Now the sound on film system, where the sound gets recorded just adjacent to the images, the frames of the images, there is a audio track that runs across the entire length of the film. Now there are two ways in which it got recorded. One was variable amplitude and the other was the variable density. Okay, so that means changing of the frequency, the density of the audio recording changed, and the other one with the changing of the frequency, the amplitude of the audio recording changed. So by looking at the thing, one could easily make out that whether it was a variable density recording or variable amplitude or variable area recording. Okay, so that sealed the fate of the talkies, and the crossover was now a serious matter. The movie hall started advertising 100% all talkies. Okay, there would be written 100% all talkies, and the studios also had to rise to the occasion, and they also had to record films that would be talking. So that was the clamor for the conversion to talkies. And this is the time when the producers faced a lot of problems which was totally unanticipated. So I will tell you about the problems one by one. Number one, many European actors and actresses had migrated to Hollywood to make a career in acting because it was a lucrative career, the payment was good, and there was constant flow of work because of the studio system. So like Greta Garbo and so many others, they had migrated to Hollywood. Now in the silent era, they didn't have to do any talking. Okay, so it was safe. I mean, they had to have a good screen presence, and that would be it. Okay, but now when the talkies came, they had to say dialogues. They were expected to say dialogues. So many of them didn't know English properly, and even if they could speak English, it would be with a very heavy European accent, either a Scandinavian accent or a French accent or whatever, which would be unacceptable to the English-speaking audience in America as well as in England. So therefore, these actors and actresses had to take crash course in spoken English. Some of them took it very well, and they continued their career in the talkies era also, and some of them just couldn't cope up with it. Okay, they had a good screen presence, but when it came to talking, either they didn't have a good diction or a good voice, or they couldn't really pick up the nuances of spoken English. So their career ended with the coming of the talkies. Whereas actresses like Greta Garbo, who remained stars even in the talkie era because they learnt spoken English very well and they could say their dialogues with elan. So that was one big problem that was faced in the crossover era. The second problem is that the microphone became the king of the set. All right, all sound, all the dialogues were recorded live. So the microphone was hidden either in the chandelier or in the flower vase amidst the flowers, and those days the microphones were big. It was not small microphones as we see today, okay, or under the table, and the actors had to hover around the microphone and say their dialogues. They couldn't wander off too far away from the microphone. Okay, there was no cordless microphone those days. So even if the microphone was stitched to the body of the actor, he was always tied with a cord like an umbilical cord, and his movement was restricted. All right. So therefore, everything, all design of the movement of the actors was dictated by the presence of the microphone. Okay, so that was a big problem. Next big problem is that in the silent era, if you see pictures of shooting in the silent era, you will see that on one studio floor, several shootings used to take place simultaneously. So supposing you have a big studio floor, so in one corner, shooting of say one Charlie Chaplin film would be taking place, and in the other corner of the studio, some other film shooting would easily be taking place, because the noise and the cross-talking did not affect. Okay, so happily one studio floor was optimized for 2 or more shootings simultaneously. But now with the coming of sound, because the dialogues were also recorded along with the visuals, recorded live so to say, on one floor only one shooting could take place, okay, not more than one. Okay, and also the studio floor had to be made soundproof, so that the outside noise would not come in and the inside sound also would not spill outside. Okay. So overnight the studio owners had to invest in making the studio floors completely soundproof. So that was a big investment that had to go in. Okay. Similarly, movie halls. So for playing talkies, actually the movie halls had to take projectors. The earlier projectors became obsolete. They had to take projectors that had a sound pickup. Okay, otherwise how would the sound be heard? Okay, so either they had to connect a sound speaker to the existing projector, or better still, they had to take new projectors. And all these projectors had to run at the rate of 24 frames per second. Because in the silent era, it was not so standardized. It would be either 16 frames per second, 20 frames per second, or 24 frames per second, or even a little more. It would not really matter so much. Okay, but in the sound era, it mattered very much, because if the sound is recorded at 24 frames per second and played back at 16 frames per second, then suddenly the pitch of the voices would increase. The frequency would increase, and the male voice would begin to sound like a female voice. All right. So therefore, in order to keep that fidelity in the audio recording, the recording speed and the playback speed had to be exactly the same. So the camera had to run at 24 frames per second, and the projectors also had to run at 24 frames per second to give a faithful audio playback of the recording. Okay. So there was this additional investment that was necessary. And then the most important thing is that when the camera runs, it makes a tick, 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 tick noise, because the motion is pull, stop, pull, stop, pull, stop mechanism. Okay. So it makes this tick, 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 tick constant noise. Now that, and then the microphone is here and the camera suppose is running here. So the microphone will pick up the tick, 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 tick sound of the camera. Okay. That would interfere with the recording of the dialogue. So what would be done? The camera was confined into a soundproof glass casing. Why glass? Because so that through the glass also the camera could see. Okay, and the double layered glass was kept put so that it would be totally soundproof. And the camera and the cameraman sat inside the glass casing, and the cameraman, poor thing, he sweated away because it was a small confined place, and so they call it the ice box. Okay, so the cameraman was confined to the ice box, and the camera suddenly lost all its mobility. It could not track, it could not crane up and down, it could not go outside the studio. Most of the recording, most of the shooting happened indoors in the studio, okay, and the camera lost its mobility. So that was another very big problem that was faced in the transition years, the first 2-3 years after the coming of sound, after 1927. Okay. So the aesthetic height that was attained by in the silent era suddenly took a nosedive, and film lost all the earlier aesthetics. Suddenly, movies stopped moving. The actors had to be confined around the microphone. The camera had to be confined in the glass box. Okay, even the editing had to be. One couldn't do Battleship Potemkin kind of short fragmentary editing, that kind of montage, because along with the visual, the sound also had to be cut, and it could not be cut in the middle of a sentence. Alright, so the editing also lost its pace, and it was a kind of aesthetic crisis situation, because only a few kinds of genres like family dramas or musicals, which could be done entirely within the studio, became popular, and all the other genres which required outdoor recording, they took a backseat. So that was a very critical time. And we shall see in the next lecture that how this was overcome, and then how again cinema got back its fluidity, its mobility, and its aesthetic greatness. So that's all for this episode. Thank you very much. I hope you have enjoyed the talk. Thank you.